Hey, Steve Magnante here from the Junkyard Crawl. You guys probably all know that for the last 18 years, I also do the Barrett-Jackson collector car auctions in Scottsdale, Las Vegas, Palm Beach, Florida, and Reno. Well, for the next few days, I'm going to be at the Las Vegas auction, and I won't be able to be in the junkyard to make fresh videos. So instead, what I'm going to give you is for 6 days in a row, 15-minute segments of the 90-minute video, How to Build Altered Wheelbase Funny Cars. Now, this is a DVD I used to sell for $19.95. I made it back in 2007, but it still holds water today. You can actually watch a 63 Dodge Dart turn into a funny car. There's also race footage from the Wilshire Shaker. There's also a Ford Fairmont altered wheelbase car. So again, for 6 days, we'll have 15-minute episodes of how to build an altered wheelbase funny cars running from front to back. And when I get back from Barrett-Jackson, we'll get right back to the junkyard. But in the meantime, enjoy how to build altered wheelbase cars starting right now. In the past 5 years or so, there's been a tremendous boom in interest in altered wheelbase funny cars from the 1960s. And we call this trend the match bash trend. And basically what we're doing is we're building streetable replicas of old-time funny cars. Now, we don't want to run hydrazine and nitromethane and go into the 8s. These cars run on gasoline typically, and they're good for 10 to 11 second performance, which is fine. They capture the feeling, the mood, and the look of an old-time funny car. But the beauty is you can build these things on your own. You don't have to have an elaborate chassis jig or a big-time shop. You can do this job in your backyard. And we're going to prove that right here. We're going to take this 1963 Dodge Dart, we're going to alter the wheelbase on this car. We're going to move the rear wheels forward, move the front wheels forward, and show you how to do it. Now keep in mind, we're in a backyard in Southern California. If we can do it here, you can do it anywhere. Before we can start cutting on our Dart, we have to determine exactly how much alteration we want to give the car. Now we go back to history for our guide. Old car magazines, you can't do any better than these. Now we all know that 1965 is when Chrysler pretty much started the altered wheelbase factory program with a fleet of about 11 Dodges and Plymouths. They had the rear axles move forward 15 inches, the fronts move forward 10 inches. This basically gave them a 110-inch wheelbase with that radical shift. And of course, their extreme appearance gave them the name funny car. You can see they had tremendous weight distribution, excellent traction. They started pulling wheelies overnight. Great cars. Now our little Dodge Dart is a slightly different car because it starts life with a 111-inch wheelbase. It's a compact car versus these mid-size B-bodies. So what we'll do is once again go to history. We'll look at our old magazines and dig up some ideas so we get this car right and don't get lost in the process of turning this car into a funny car. Now our bogey, of course, is the Esserman Dodge Rampage. Now we can see here in its very first form, this car had a max wedge motor and a standard wheelbase. You can bet this car, with those little tiny tires, didn't hook too good. You can see very shortly, Jack Esserman and the guys at the Dodge dealership moved the rear wheels forward, replaced the front suspension with a Dodge van axle, shoved that forward, and installed a race Hemi in place of the max wedge. Now, further inspection of this picture shows us that the center line of the axle to the door gap is pretty close. That looks like about 15 inches. Now I got to say, I'm going to step in a little bit and interject my taste on this. Too much can be too much. In the case of our Dodge Dart, we're going to follow a more subtle approach. More ideas come from these cars. This here is the Liberty Motors Corruptor's Pup. This was a 64 Dodge Dart that had an injected Hemi motor. And the rear axle, again, we can see that the door gap to the axle center line is actually farther away than it is on the Rampage. This probably went about 10 inches, just going by rule of thumb. At the front of the car, we can see, of course, that another A100 van front suspension replaces the stock stuff, and that's been shoved forward. It's got to be 5 or 6 inches right there. It's a pretty extreme effect at the front, kind of subtle at the back. Going further, we see that Dick Landy, of course, he had this Hemi-powered 65 and 66, depending on what year, Dodge Dart. Now, he moved the rear wheels forward, it looks like about 12 inches. You can see the distance from here, the door, to the center line, is probably 12 inches or so. We're going to go for that effect right there. Now, of course, the most extreme full-body Dodge Dart would have been the Ram Charger's 1966 car, this insane tube-frame car with the injected Hemi and the fiberglass body. We're not going that far. I'd love to, but for this project, we're going to go right back to 1965 and pretty much grab the basic vibration of the Esterman Dodge Rampage as we see it here. Okay, knowing that we're going to relocate our rear axle 12 inches from its stock location, let's take a moment to really think about what we're about to do. This can be as complicated or as easy as we make it. Now, I've done a few of these cars, and what I'll tell you is this: it's very easy as long as you leave the entire rear suspension and floor pan as one piece and move them forward under the car. You'll see what we're talking about as this tape gets going. But if we cut these parts into sub-assemblies, like if we separate the wheel houses from over the axle, take the springs off the car, we create a puzzle that's going to be real hard to put back together. But the beauty of this thing is, by leaving the entire rear suspension in one section, and the floor pan in one section, and moving that forward, this is a piece of cake. Now, the job begins with marking the original rear axle centerline location. Now, the car at this point is supported up off the ground as high as we can get it, because we're going to go under the car to look at the frame and the floorboards to make sure that the plan to be set out on the side of the car we can do under the car. You don't want to be cutting into frame rails or cutting into leaf springs. We'll show you that in a couple of minutes. But again, this is just an inspection mode we're in right here. When we actually start cutting, the car will be down lower. It'll be supported, but the tires will be in contact. More on that in a minute. Now, the very beginning of this whole thing is using a plumb bob of sorts. This is a Chevy L88 alternator pulley and a string and some good tape. And we're going to basically mark where the rear axle centerline is in stock trim. 12 inches is what we're going to take out of this car from here. So we pull this all forward by 12 inches. And when we're done, the rear axle will be up here. Now, of course, we have a whole lot of metal to get out of the way beforehand. Now, like I said earlier, we are going to take this entire section of the car from this side all the way to that side in one piece and slide it forward under the car. Now, of course, before we can do that, we have to remove an equal 12-inch section ahead of this area from the car. Another thing to keep in mind, though, is underneath this vehicle, there's a leaf spring on each side and a frame, a subframe. So what I'll do now is I'll go under the car to make sure that we can take 12 inches out of the floor without getting into any trouble with the rest of the vehicle. Let's go underneath the car and take a look. Underneath our Dart, we see a beautiful thing. Nice rust-free floors, at least from this side. They're solid, and they don't have undercoating. A lot of California cars were built without undercoating. That means that as we slice and cut through this car, we won't have to deal with the smell of that stuff catching fire, burning, and generally being a nuisance. Now, as we were talking earlier, we're going to be moving the entire rear suspension forward in this car 1 foot. It means we're going to have to separate it from the vehicle in a few minutes and roll it forward. But before we get into cutting anything, we've got to be sure that we actually can separate and move this forward without creating a lot of extra work. What that means basically is we want to keep the floor pan in one piece from right here where the frame begins to all the way to the rear of the leaf spring where it joins the car. We're going to cut that entire section out and roll it forward. No kidding, it sounds crazy, but you watch. It's not that hard. But as I mark the outside of the car, there is a disconnect basically between the amount of distance on the outside of the car and the amount of distance on the inside of the car. We're going to have to separate the rockers from the quarter panels ever so gently to slide forward. Now back under the car here, what we're going to do is cut right across here. There's a body seam that Chrysler so nicely put here for us. I'm going to take out 12 inches of this floor area, the rusted floor area, so that we can roll this whole part forward under the car. But again, looking underneath any candidate for altered wheelbase work is very important, because what you don't want to do is create a situation where you mark the outside of the car for work you can't do onto the car because there's frame parts in the way. Very important to leave everything in one piece and just shift it forward. Again, just take out 1 foot where the passengers, the backseat passengers, would put their feet. Take that section out of the car and then move everything forward in one piece. We'll be doing patchwork behind the frame rails where we create a gap, no big deal. And the whole job is actually very simple. But again, important to look under the car to make sure that you're not creating problems for yourself. In case of a Chrysler A or B body unit car, they're very simple vehicles. And again, leave it in one piece, move it as an assembly, and the job is a piece of cake. With a plan for how we'll handle the floor and frame shaping up, let's now spend a little more time on the outside of the car. Now, generally, most cars have a rear window and a rear window winder that hides right behind the quarter panel here. In the case of all the old funny cars, the window roller mechanism was deleted because when you move the rear end forward, there's no room for a back seat, so you don't really have to worry about it. So what we'll do is we'll reinstall the side glass and fix it in the up position, case closed. We've also confirmed that behind this skin, there's no structural members in here that are really going to screw us up. So we know that the floor, the frame, and the internal vertical structures are good. Now all we need to do is be sure that we can mark the side of the car off so we make our cut lines properly. That's done by using a horizontal mark all the way across here. Be sure that it's truly horizontal. The way to know that it is to use a bubble level, this here, and basically just confirm that known reference points truly are horizontal. From there, you can safely draw lines down the side of the car and along the horizontal lines where you're going to be cutting the car. Mark them in with a black Sharpie, and you know where you're going to be slicing into the vehicle. Now keep in mind that the external cutting and the underneath cutting take place on 2 different levels. We'll show you that in a few minutes. But once you separate these parts from the vehicle, you're ready to roll it forward. This area here, 12 inches long exactly, will slice out, and this will be mated when we're done. One quick word about applying these lines to the side of your car. Chrome trim, like the stuff on this car here, we've removed it, but the lines are still there and the mounting holes are there. You can't always count on that stuff being truly horizontal. One thing that generally is horizontal would be the door sill. But in the case of our Dart, these holes are made on a basically horizontal plane, which is good. So what I've done is I've measured 3 inches down in several locations using the drilled holes as my reference point. Then I marked an X exactly 3 inches down from that, which establishes essentially a line right here down the center of the side of the car. Now you'll notice that I put the cut line here above this body line, and below here we want to basically be doing our later body work on a flat surface. You don't want to cut down this low here because then you've got to recreate this curve. You don't want to do that. It's much easier to rework and do body work on flattish surfaces. So that's why we put our cut line right here. And again, once we've had that, the lines are in, we can just basically take our marker and go across and create the places we're going to be slicing into our car to separate this panel from the rest of the vehicle. Now, behind the rear wheel, there is something that's going to have to be done. It's a patch. This is for later on, but it's something to be thinking about right now. You can see I've put a line here, which is where we're going to separate this to move it forward. That will create a gap that'll be 12 inches long right here. We will have to make a gradual contour change right here. We'll show how that's done. But these are little things that all add up to create a very interesting and cool funny car effect. With the driver's side of the car marked off, we have to transfer the same horizontal and vertical lines to the passenger side of the car. We've already done that. The nice thing is that the body trim holes on this car are symmetrical from side to side. That allowed us to put identical cut lines on both sides of the car. That's critical. Otherwise, the car can wind up bent when you weld it all back together again.